The first morning I heard that thing spinning, I honestly thought a piece of farm equipment had broken somewhere on my property. It was this deep metallic groan rolling across the fields like something alive was trapped inside the steel. And when I stepped outside with my coffee, I saw a 30-foot twisting sculpture of polished metal blades turning right beside my fence line, throwing flashes of sunlight straight into my kitchen window. I remember standing there in my boots, still half asleep, thinking, "You have got to be kidding me. They actually built this thing here?" My name is Daniel Harper, and for most of my life, I lived on a quiet stretch of farmland outside Cedar Ridge, Colorado, the kind of place where the loudest sounds were usually birds in the morning, wind moving through the grass, and my old tractor struggling to start on cold days. I wasn't looking for trouble. I wasn't trying to fight anyone. I was just a guy who wanted to wake up, feed my animals, fix things around my property, and enjoy the little piece of land I had spent decades building. But the people from the Willow Creek Estates HOA next door had a different idea of what peaceful living meant, and apparently their version involved installing what looked like a giant spinning metal tornado right on the edge of my property. The sculpture was supposed to be some kind of community landmark, a symbol of modern design, according to the HOA president, Malcolm Whitmore, a retired architect who had a habit of using big words for simple things. He loved phrases like visual harmony, community identity, and architectural expression. I'll give him credit. The man could make a fence sound like a philosophical movement. When I first approached him about it, I tried to be reasonable. I walked over to their neighborhood entrance where they had gathered for the unveiling ceremony, and I remember seeing a crowd of homeowners standing there taking pictures like they had just built a miniature Eiffel Tower. Malcolm was smiling like he had personally changed the future of architecture. I waited until the crowd cleared and said, "Malcolm, we need to talk about that sculpture." He turned around with this calm little smile and said, "Daniel, I assume you mean our new community installation." I said, "I mean the giant machine making noise 24 hours a day and shining into my house." He laughed a little, not loudly, but enough that I knew exactly how seriously he was taking me. "It's art, Daniel. It's designed to interact with nature." I looked back at the spinning steel blades and said, "Well, nature seems pretty annoyed with it." He didn't find that funny. He told me the sculpture represented progress and that since I didn't live inside the HOA community, it really wasn't my concern. That sentence stayed with me because it wasn't just dismissive. It showed exactly how they saw people like me. Someone outside their little circle. Someone whose property could be affected but whose opinion didn't matter. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself maybe I was just being stubborn, maybe I needed time to adjust. But after a few weeks, it became impossible. The sound wasn't just annoying anymore. It became part of every day. The low humming vibration traveled through the ground. At night, when everything around my property went quiet, that steel structure became the only thing I could hear. My cows started avoiding the corner of the pasture closest to the sculpture. I know that sounds strange, but animals notice things before people do. They would walk around that section like there was something wrong with the ground. The worst part was the reflection. Every time the sun hit those polished blades, bright flashes bounced across my windows. Some mornings I would be sitting at my kitchen table drinking coffee, and suddenly the whole room would light up like someone was flicking a giant mirror outside. I finally decided I needed to document everything. I wasn't interested in starting a war with my neighbors. I just wanted them to acknowledge that their project was affecting someone else. I used my phone to measure the sound near the fence line, and the readings were consistently above 70 decibels. I took videos. I wrote down dates and times. Then I sent a polite letter to the HOA explaining the problem and asking if they could work with me on a solution. I expected maybe a conversation, maybe a meeting, maybe even some compromise. Instead, a few days later, I received a thick envelope with the Willow Creek Estates logo printed across the front. Inside was a letter full of legal language about community improvements, aesthetic standards, and easement considerations. It was the kind of letter written to make an ordinary person feel small. I read it twice, then laughed. Because at that point I realized something. They weren't interested in solving the problem. They were interested in proving they could ignore me. And that was the moment everything changed. Because I stopped seeing that sculpture as just an ugly piece of metal. I started seeing it as a test of whether someone with enough confidence and enough paperwork could simply build whatever they wanted and expect everyone else to accept it. So I wrote them back, but this time I included something they clearly hadn't bothered to check: the county regulations. And that was when I found the first crack in their perfect little monument. The next morning, I drove straight to the county planning office with a folder full of pictures, sound measurements, and copies of every letter I had exchanged with the HOA. I wasn't walking in there looking for revenge. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I just wanted to know one simple thing. How did a 30-foot rotating steel structure get built next to my property without anyone asking whether it was actually allowed? The woman behind the counter was named Rebecca, and she had the kind of expression you see from someone who has spent 20 years watching people discover problems they created themselves. I handed her the documents and explained the situation. She started pulling up records, clicking through permits, and checking the county database. At first, she didn't say much. Then she stopped scrolling. She leaned closer to the screen and looked at the photos I had brought. "This is the structure you're talking about?" she asked. I said, "Yes, unfortunately." She looked back at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen again. "That thing is bigger than what was approved for this area." That got my attention. I asked her what she meant. She explained that structures over a certain height required additional review, especially anything involving moving components, reflective surfaces, or potential hazards near controlled air routes. I honestly didn't even know half those rules existed. I'm a farmer, not a zoning expert. I fix fences, repair engines, and spend more time checking weather forecasts than reading county codes. But sitting there in that office, I realized something important. Rules only protect you if someone actually checks them. I asked Rebecca to pull every public document related to the sculpture. She printed pages of records. And the more I read, the more confused I became. There was no special height variance. There was no completed engineering certification for the rotating mechanism. There was no environmental review attached to the project. Somehow, on thing I that neck, this massive moving structure had gone from an idea in an HOA meeting to a permanent installation beside my land without anyone stopping to ask the obvious questions. I remember looking at those papers and feeling something between anger and disbelief. It wasn't just that they built something annoying. It was that they were so confident nobody would challenge them. They assumed a quiet landowner would just complain for a few weeks and eventually give up. And honestly, maybe that's what they were used to. Maybe other people had learned that fighting an HOA with lawyers and money was exhausting. But they made one mistake with me. They confused being patient with being powerless. Rebecca pointed to one section of the paperwork and said something that changed everything. "You might want to contact County Air Safety Compliance." I asked why. She looked at the photos again and said, "Because depending on the exact location, that could create a visibility issue." I left that office with a completely different feeling than when I arrived. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. There is a big difference between someone fighting because they are emotional and someone fighting because they have evidence. The first thing I did when I got home was measure everything again. I mapped the distance from the sculpture to the fence line. I documented the height. I recorded the reflections during different times of the day. I even filmed the way the blades moved when the wind picked up. Then I submitted a formal complaint with all the information attached. I expected it to take months. I figured it would disappear into some government office somewhere, buried under paperwork and forgotten. But 2 weeks later, I was standing on my porch drinking coffee when I saw a White County vehicle slowly pull up near the entrance of my driveway. 2 inspectors stepped out wearing county identification badges, and I'll admit, there was a small part of me that wanted to smile. Not because I wanted someone to lose, not because I hated my neighbors, but because for the first time since this whole thing started, I felt like someone was finally looking at the situation objectively. The inspectors walked around the sculpture, measuring angles, checking distances, taking notes. They stood there for almost an hour while the steel blades turned above them, making that same awful humming sound that had become part of my daily life. One of them eventually walked over and asked me, "You said this was installed without proper notice?" I nodded and said, "That's what I believe." He looked back at the sculpture and shook his head slightly. "If the records are accurate, they may have a serious problem." Word traveled fast. It always does in small communities. By the next afternoon, 3 HOA board members showed up at my gate, and the funny thing was, they didn't look like the confident people from the unveiling ceremony anymore. No polished speeches, no talk about architectural identity, no smiles for the cameras. They looked worried. Malcolm Whitmore was there too, still trying to keep that professional architect image, but I could see the frustration behind his eyes. "Daniel," he said, "we feel like this situation has escalated unnecessarily." I almost laughed because that sentence coming from him was unbelievable. I said, "Unnecessarily? You built a 30-foot machine next to my home and ignored every concern I raised." Another board member stepped forward and said, "You could have come back to us instead of involving the county." I looked at the sculpture spinning behind them and said, "I did come to you. More than once. You just decided my concerns didn't matter." Nobody said anything for a few seconds. That silence told me more than any argument could have. They knew. They knew they had underestimated me. They knew they had treated my property like it was just empty space outside their community boundary. A week later, the county issued the official order. The sculpture was found to be in violation due to safety concerns and noise complaints. The HOA was given instructions to stop operation immediately and begin the removal process. And that was when everything flipped. The same people who called it a symbol of progress were suddenly calling it a misunderstanding. The same people who told me I had no say were suddenly asking why we couldn't all work together. But by then, the conversation had changed. It was no longer about whether I liked the sculpture. It was about whether anyone gets to ignore rules just because they believe their intentions are good. The removal crews arrived early one cloudy morning, and I stood by my fence watching the giant metal structure that had caused months of frustration slowly come apart piece by piece. For the first time in a long time, my property was quiet again. But the most interesting part wasn't watching the sculpture disappear. It was watching the people who built it realize that sometimes the biggest thing standing in your way isn't your neighbor. Sometimes it's the assumption that nobody will ever make you answer for what you did. I still remember the exact moment the last bolt came loose from that sculpture. It was early in the morning, the kind of quiet morning where the air feels clean and the whole world seems to move a little slower. The workers had been there for hours, taking apart what the HOA once called a masterpiece of modern community design. Funny how quickly a masterpiece becomes a problem once someone in authority starts asking the right questions. The giant steel blades that had been spinning above my pasture for months were now sitting on the ground in separate pieces, looking a lot less impressive than they did when they were standing 30 feet tall. And I'll admit something. Watching it come down felt different than I expected. I thought I would feel some huge rush of satisfaction, like I had won some great battle. I thought maybe I'd stand there smiling, feeling like I had defeated the HOA. But the truth was, I mostly felt relief. Quiet, simple relief. The kind you feel when a constant headache finally disappears. Because the truth is, I never wanted a fight. I never woke up one morning thinking, you know what my life needs? A legal battle with a neighborhood association. I had enough things to worry about already. Equipment breaking down, weather changes, keeping up with the land. Normal problems. The kind of problems that come with owning property and living a simple life. The last thing I wanted was to spend my evenings reading county regulations and collecting evidence about a spinning metal sculpture. But sometimes, the thing you don't want to fight becomes the thing you have no choice but to stand up against. After the county issued the removal order, the attitude from the HOA changed almost overnight. The same people who once walked around proudly talking about community vision suddenly started using words like miscommunication and unfortunate circumstances. I found that interesting because when I first came to them with a simple complaint, nobody talked about communication. Nobody talked about compromise. They talked about ownership boundaries. They talked about how I didn't belong to their community. They acted like because my house sat outside their HOA line, my concerns somehow stopped mattering. But once the county became involved, suddenly everyone wanted to talk. A few days after the removal order, Malcolm Whitmore came back to my property. This time he didn't come with 3 board members behind him and that confident smile he always wore. He came alone. He stood near the gate, looking out at the empty space where the sculpture had been. For a second, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because I could tell that, in his mind, this project was never supposed to become a disaster. He probably really believed he was creating something special. And maybe that was the hardest part to accept. Most conflicts don't begin with someone waking up and deciding to be the bad guy. They begin when someone becomes so convinced they are right that they stop listening to anyone else. Malcolm finally said, "Daniel, I still believe the sculpture brought value to the community." I nodded and said, "Maybe it did, but value to one group doesn't erase problems for someone else." He didn't answer immediately. He just looked across the field. Then he said something that surprised me. "I guess we should have talked to you sooner." I looked at him and said, "Yeah, you should have." It wasn't a dramatic movie moment. Nobody apologized with tears. Nobody admitted everything was their fault. Real life usually doesn't work that way. Sometimes the closest you get to an apology is someone finally realizing they should have listened. A few weeks later, things around the neighborhood started changing. I noticed people walking more slowly when they passed my property. Some of the residents who had supported the sculpture project started avoiding conversations about it. Others actually came over and apologized for assuming I was just being difficult. One man named Carl, who lived 3 houses inside Willow Creek Estates, stopped by one afternoon while I was fixing a section of fence. He leaned against his truck and said, "I owe you an apology." I looked at him and asked what for. He said, "I thought you just hated the neighborhood. I thought you were one of those people who complain about everything." I laughed because I knew exactly why he thought that. That's how the story had been presented. I was the outsider, the difficult neighbor, the guy who didn't understand progress. But the truth was much simpler. I wasn't against improvement. I was against being ignored. I told Carl, "I don't care if they build 100 sculptures over there. Just don't build something that affects my home and then tell me my opinion doesn't count." He nodded, and I think that was the moment a lot of people finally understood what the whole fight was really about. It wasn't about a sculpture. It was about respect. It was about whether living next to someone means anything when a decision is made. It's easy to talk about community when everyone agrees with you. The real test comes when someone outside your group says, "Wait, this affects me too." That's where respect actually begins. Looking back now, I think the biggest lesson I learned was that patience is a lot more powerful than people realize. The HOA had money. They had lawyers. They had a board full of people who were used to getting their way. But what they didn't have was the one thing that mattered most: proof. They believed confidence could replace facts. They believed a polished presentation could cover up missing approvals. They believed nobody would take the time to challenge them. And that was their mistake, because sometimes the person who looks the least powerful is actually the person who has been paying the closest attention. Today, that corner of my property looks completely different. The grass has filled back in. The cows wander there again without hesitation. My mornings are quiet. No metallic humming. No flashes of light across my kitchen. No feeling that someone else's idea of beauty was invading my own backyard. And every once in a while, I'll stand there with my coffee and look across the field, remembering how strange the whole thing was. A 30-foot piece of steel caused months of conflict between neighbors who could have solved everything with one honest conversation. That's the part that still bothers me. Not the sculpture, not the paperwork, not even the money. It's how easy it is for people to forget that behind every property line is a person. Someone with a life, memories, routines, and a right to have a say when decisions start affecting them. So now I want to hear what you think. If you were in my position, would you have done the same thing? Would you have gone straight to the county after the HOA ignored your concerns? Or would you have kept trying to negotiate with your neighbors? Was this a case of someone protecting their property rights? Or did it go too far by turning a community disagreement into a legal battle? Because honestly, those are the situations that create the biggest debates, where one side sees a beautiful improvement and the other side sees a problem being forced onto them. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd really like to know where you stand. And if you enjoy stories about neighborhood conflicts, unexpected legal battles, and ordinary people who refuse to be pushed around, make sure to share this story and subscribe for more. Because sometimes the biggest victories don't come from making the most noise. Sometimes they come from staying patient, gathering the facts, and waiting for the truth to finally catch up.